Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video and a new Material 3 video. In this video, I will talk about selection UI components of Material 3. Specifically what that means, on the one hand, we will cover checkboxes, so these things here, or also these tri-state checkboxes, which you can use to toggle all off or on. Then we will talk about switches, which have the same concept as checkboxes, so you can either toggle them on or off. And we will talk about radio buttons, and in which scenario you should now use what kind of selection UI component. So again, as these other videos in this playlist, this will be heavily focused on UX, but if you're a beginner and just don't know how to implement these in your code, this video will also help you out. And I want to start with checkboxes. When should you use these checkboxes here? Use them if your user can pick one or multiple related options. And here it's very important that they are related. So in this case, all these are file types. They are about the same thing. And as you can also see, you can optionally add such a parent category kind of, where you can use this tri-state checkbox to toggle them all on or off, as I've shown you. So let's get into coding and see how we can implement that. Because that will be a little bit of code. I want to put that in a separate composable here in a blank Material 3 Jetpack Compose project. So just a new composable function, and I will call this checkboxes. And by default, this checkbox composable we get from Material 3, which we have to use, this is really just the box. This does not contain any option to enter some text next to that. So this text is not included in this checkbox composable. It's really only this box that can be checked or unchecked. Because of that, each checkbox in the end consists of two pieces of state. On the one hand, the checked state, so if it's checked or not, and the text that we actually want to display. And that is why I like to create a data class here for a toggleable info. So just an info for a toggleable UI component. On the one hand, whether it's checked or not, and then the text we want to display for that, because then we can just create a bunch of these info classes and then loop over them to create our checkboxes. I want to do that in here, in our checkboxes composable. We want to create our checkboxes list here, and that is equal to remember. And I want to use a mutable state list of here, so just a mutable list, which consists of compose states. And here we can then create our sample items. So actually not a list of, because we already have that list of. So we can directly create our toggleable infos in here. Let's say they are all unchecked by default, and the text will be photos here. We can then copy this section, paste it 2 more times. This would be videos, and this would be audio. And we can then take this checkboxes state and loop over all these checkboxes. So checkboxes dot for each. Let's actually do for each indexed. So we also get reference to the index of the loop, and then we get our info here. And in here, we need a row because, as I said, a checkbox by default does not come with a text, but we want to display the checkbox next to the text. So we use a row here. It's important to use vertical alignment center vertically, otherwise the text will be misaligned. Alignment dot center vertically. And in here, in this row, we on the one hand have our checkbox on the left. So this is how we use this. Super simple. We just have to pass our Boolean, whether it's checked or not, which is just whether this current info element we're looping over is checked or not. So we can just say info.isChecked. And when the user now clicks on this checkbox to toggle the state, then this onChecked change lambda is called. It gives us the new isChecked state. So if it was unchecked before, then this Boolean would now be true, and vice versa. If that happens, what do we want to do? We want to find the checkbox the user clicked on in our list, which we can do with the text, for example, and then just update the isChecked state for that. So we want to say our checkboxes list at the index of our index is equal to our info.copy, and we change the isChecked state to the new isChecked state. And then after that, we just put in some text that says info.text. And if we now scroll up to our root composable, in here we can put in a column. Modifier is modifier dot filmmax size, and we just want to add some padding. That's it. In here we can call our checkboxes composable And if we then launch this very first example, take a look here. Then you can see here are our few checkboxes, and we can then toggle these on or off. That obviously doesn't look like in my first sample because we don't have this tri-state checkbox yet. So a tri-state checkbox is, as the name says, a checkbox that has 3 different states. So not only checked and unchecked, but also kind of an idle or initial state. So if we take a look at that again, then you can see this is the tri-state checkbox, and typically this initial state, which is just this little line or dash, that just indicates, hey, you can use this checkbox here to toggle them all on or off, but you don't have to. So you can also individually mark specific checkboxes as checked or not. But if you want to toggle them all on or off, you can use this tri-state checkbox. And as soon as you use it, then you can get it back to this third state, which is rather just the initial state. So now you can only check it and uncheck it, or you can still change the checkbox individually. So it makes sense to use that if you really have such a parent category for multiple checkboxes. And if you now wonder how you can implement this tri-state checkbox, let's dive into our code. In our checkboxes composable, and I want to do this above this for each indexed loop. Here we want to first of all specify our tri-state. So we have our tri-state, which is by remember. This actually needs to be a var by remember. And in here we have a mutable state of. And this tri-state is, as a class, just a toggleable state. And we can say toggleable state dot indeterminate. So this is the state when it's neither checked or unchecked. And then it also has this on or off, which would be checked and unchecked. So we want to use this indeterminate by default. We can import this here. So I'll enter to import this, and there we go. And then below this, we can have our one tri-state checkbox. The state is just our tri-state. And when we click this checkbox, so this has an on-click function rather than something like on-check changed, because we now need to implement the logic for this on our own, because there's no default logic for these tri-state checkboxes. So for toggling this, we can create a little lambda function here, toggle tri-state. Here we first of all just want to update our tri-state, which is dependent on the current tri-state. So if the current state is indeterminate, so the initial state, and we click this box, then we want to change it to on. This is now our custom logic. You could also start with off, but I will start with on here. If it is on, we want to change it to off, and else, so if it's off, we want to change it to on. And what we also need to do in this lambda is, if we change this tri-state, we need to update all of our checkboxes here inside of this row, or this for loop rather, since if we use our tri-state checkbox, then all are actually toggled on or off. So we need to loop over these checkboxes here again. So checkboxes dot for each. And actually you want to use checkboxes that indices for each. So we just loop over the indices, we get the index, and then we say checkboxes at this index is now equal to checkboxes at the index dot copy. So we just change the is checked state to tri-state equal to on. What is it? Toggleable state dot on. So that means if our tri-state is now on after we've updated it, we will change all checkboxes, since we loop over all of these, to checked. And if it's off, then we change it to unchecked. So if we now take this lambda, put it in here to toggle tri-state, we also maybe use such a row here, since we want to display some text next to that tri-state checkbox. And then copy that like this. Yes, now it works. We put in our tri-state checkbox and then some text next to that, which could be file types. So that just summarizes what you can now check with this checkbox. If we now launch this, then you probably guess how that will look like right here. So we have our tri-state checkbox, which has this indeterminate state by default. You can still toggle these individually, but if we use this, then we can toggle them all on or toggle them all off. But something very important here in regards to user experience, which I hate when apps don't follow that, is that these checkboxes should also be toggleable when you click on the text of it. And that currently doesn't happen. So if I click on the text, then it doesn't toggle. It only toggles if I click on the box specifically. But especially for mobile apps, which usually are limited in size, or the UI is limited to a small screen size, your tap is not as precise as with a mouse on a computer. So definitely make the whole area here tappable and toggle the checkbox if the user taps on it. How can we achieve that? Well, we need to also apply a modifier to this outer row. So this row is now the outer container for both our checkbox and the text. That is also why I've made this a lambda to toggle the TriState, because now we can easily say modifier is modifier dot clickable, and in here we call our toggle TriState. And the same for our row down here. We want to use modifier is equal to vertically center. What am I missing? Oh, I only have vertically here. Modifier is modifier dot clickable, and in here we just want to execute the same line of code as when we changed the checked state for a checkbox. Here we don't have access to the new is checked state, but since we just want to toggle it, we can set this to info is checked negated. And if we now go back in the app, you will see how this looks like. Now we can also press here on this text and we can toggle the checkbox like that. It looks a little bit ugly because the ripple effect does not have the same spacing on the right as it has on the left. We can easily fix this by adding this spacing here after this modifier. So we say padding and is 16 dp, Alt enter to import dp, and we do the same for our TriState checkbox for the row actually. So we say padding end is 16 dp, and for this row down here, what we also want to make sure is that we might also want to change the start padding to something like 32 dp, since then we will get this little indentation as I've shown you. So if we now take a look, then it looks like this, and we cannot toggle these. Still looks a little bit ugly because the ripple effect goes completely to the left. You can remove this by not applying the start padding here at the end, but rather have it before the clickable modifier, because the modifier works sequentially, and that way the padding will be applied before the ripple effect. Here we can say start is 32 dp, and then it will finally look like we want. Take a look here. Now we can only press it like here, and the space is exactly the same on the right as it is on the left, and the same for this one here. So that is how we use checkboxes, and that was already the most complex type of these selection UI components. So don't worry, the switches and radio buttons will become a little bit simpler, and we can implement them with less code. So getting back to my example, switches are these kinds of things, and I'm pretty sure you know these if you have an Android device. In the end, for functionality-wise, they absolutely don't differ from checkboxes because they have an on state and they have an off state, the same as checkboxes. However, while checkboxes are used for different options that are related, so all these options are to choose some file types, one or multiple file types, such switches are used for options that are independent. So very commonly they are used to change some settings. Let's imagine you have a setting screen. Each single setting is independent of the other settings. So in these cases, you should rather use a switch. And also something very important is that toggling a switch should have a directly noticeable effect. So for example, with this sample switch to toggle dark mode, when I toggle this on, I expect that the device really switches dark mode as soon as I toggle this. So the user should not need to press some kind of confirm button before doing that. While if you have checkboxes, that's rather something the user would expect, that you choose some files and then you hit save, and you expect that the files with the following file types are actually saved. But with switches, the user should see an effect as soon as the user changes the switch. So let's dive into our code here. And at the very bottom, I'm going to create a new composable called mySwitch. And the same as our checkboxes, we need our toggleable info because we want to display some text with the switch. So we can say we have a state var switch by remember, and this is a mutable state of toggleable info is checked is initially false, for example, and the text is in this case dark mode. We then scroll down, and to implement our switch, as you can see here, in this case, I recommend to have the text left of the switch and then put the switch at the very right of the screen. That's typically how the settings screens work. While with checkboxes, it's much more common to have the text right of the checkbox. So here, we will as well just have a normal row. The vertical alignment will be center vertically. And in here, we will then start with our text. So the text would be just switch.text. Then we want to have our switch. So that is just the normal switch composable. Checked is our switch that is checked. And when that changes, that's exactly the same as for checkboxes. Then we get the new is checked state. And we can say, okay, our switch is now equal to switch.copy and is checked is checked. Right now, this would be very cramped because we have our text and right next to that our switch. So it would actually, the switch would actually be right next to the text here, which would look very ugly. I want to push this completely to the right of our screen. So we will just add a spacer here with the remaining width. And we can do this very easily by using a spacer and with, actually not a width, but a weight of 1F. So that will make sure that the spacer will use the remaining space and push the switch to the right. If we then go ahead and scroll up, right here, we can add some spacing below our checkboxes with a height of 32 dp, and then we can add our my switch. If we then take a look at our code, in our app actually, we should be able to see exactly that. Yes, we should apply some padding here, of course, but you can see here's our text, here's our switch, and we can then toggle it on or off. So let's quickly apply some padding to our column. Oh, I actually specified padding but didn't apply it. Let's pass 16 dp, and then we should also see an effect if we relaunch this. Yes, there we go. That looks much better. Something you might have noticed in my prepared sample app is that the switch has an icon. That is something we can now do with Material 3 switches, which wasn't possible with Material 2 switches. So you can pick an icon for the so-called thumbnail, so this little bubble here, and this can of course also change depending on the switch state. I will personally only use such an icon if it's very clear to the user what this means. So for checkmark, it's obviously clear that this means, okay, dark mode is enabled, and if there is an X, then it means it's disabled. But if this would now be a sun maybe, to indicate it's in light mode, then this would not always be very clear because, yes, there is a direct opposite of the sun, which is the moon, but there's much more thought involved to make the user think about what happens if I click this switch. So I would really try to stick to very simple icons in this case. We can add these icons by going to our switch encode, right here, and change that to, we want to change the thumb content, and it should be a normal icon, composable. The image vector is now dependent on if the switch is enabled or not. Content description can be null, and this image vector is dependent on if our switch is checked. We can say we use icons default check. And if it's not checked, oops, my keyboard is a little bit lagging. If it's not checked, then we want to say icons default close, which is the X icon. If we then relaunch this, take a look, you can see now we have this X. If we toggle it on, it gets switched with the check mark. And last but not least, we have so-called radio buttons, which are these, and I'm pretty sure you've used these somewhere, not necessarily in Android apps, but also on websites they are commonly used. And radio buttons are now used if the user has to pick one option and exactly one option. So while this checkbox option here could, for example, mean which types of files do you want to regularly synchronize or so. And obviously you could theoretically synchronize them all, or only two of them, or only one of them, or none of them. That is a use case for checkboxes. Down here, this could be a chooser for the user to decide where to save a specific file. So they can only choose one place where this file gets saved, and they have to pick one place because they can't just say, I don't want to save this file at all. That would be just a cancel option. But if they save it, then they have to save it somewhere. So there has to be a default option picked for radio buttons. And then when the user selects another one, then the previously one gets unselected. And in code, we can pretty much just take our checkbox composable, because the radio button one is much more simple but similar. I'm going to copy this, oops, and then paste it in here. Want to take a look what we need. First of all, rename this to radio buttons. I'll also rename this checkboxes state to radio buttons. Radio buttons. And I'll leave the options the same. Now we need to make sure that one option of these is initially checked. That is a rule of radio buttons. So let's say we check photos initially. We don't have a tri-state radio button, so we can remove this as well. So we just have our radio buttons. We also don't have this start indentation, so we can remove this padding. If we click this, it's the same rule as for checkboxes. Everything should be clickable, so the whole container. In this case, so if we click on the radio button, what we want to do is want to say radio buttons dot replace all. Since we now need to loop over these radio buttons and set them all to unchecked, except for the one we clicked on. So in here, we get each radio button info. We can say we create a copy of that, and we update this is checked state with it.text being equal to info.text. So we just find the radio button where the text is equal to the text we clicked on. And if that was the button, then we change is checked to true. And in all other cases of all other buttons, we change it to false. And we can then copy this because we need to do the same for our actual radio button. We of course need to change this here to a radio button. For radio button, it's called selected for some reason. So let's choose that. On check change is called on click. And here we also don't get the info whether it's checked or not, because if we click a radio button, we know it must be checked because we can uncheck a radio button. And in here, we do the same. If we now go up and actually add these radio buttons here as well, we can copy the spacer, paste it here, and then have our radio buttons. Launch the app, then we should hopefully see something similar to this, the different color scheme. Yes, we have radio buttons. Our photos one is initially selected, and then we can select other ones here by clicking on them, and then the previously selected one always gets unselected. So as a little recap, choose checkboxes if you have something in multiple choice style. So the user can choose 0 to multiple different options of a related set. So all these need to belong together, and you can use an optional tri-state to toggle them all on or off. Use switches if you want to toggle on or off one independent option. That is typically used for settings, and it's important that the user should directly notice an effect after toggling it on or off, such as changing dark mode. And last but not least, we talked about radio buttons where only one option can and has to be selected. So this could also be something like male or female. So I think the idea gets clear. If you now want to learn more about Jetpack Compose, then I got a free PDF for you in which you will learn about the 20 big mistakes you can do with Jetpack Compose. So I really go through 20 mistakes in very detail. Every single mistake gets its own PDF page, and you get code snippets, code solutions, how you can fix a mistake, so you can make sure that your Jetpack Compose apps perform well. If that sounds good to you, then you can get it for free by clicking the link below. And other than that, thanks for watching. I wish you an amazing rest of your week. See you back in the next video. Bye bye.